We'll now move into the world of publication ethics. But before we do, I want to invite any questions about preparing a manuscript that do not involve publication ethics. Okay, good. The other disclaimer I'll add too is I will be around for a little while after today's session ends. So particularly with this next session, if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the group, feel free to come find me afterwards. So publication ethics. What we're going to talk about here is kind of a rough guideline, some basic rules. There are differences from field to field, from country to country. There's a lot of variation here, but I'm going to talk about some general rules. When you submit a paper, you're usually asked to check a number of boxes or submit a form attesting essentially these things. That the work is original, that it's actually yours. I had one case just recently where a reviewer submitted a paper that they'd gotten from another manuscript and put their name on it. And yet signed a little form saying that it was theirs until we found that original paper. That the data are real and not fabricated. That you've obtained any necessary permissions to reprint material that you didn't create. That you've obtained any necessary privacy waivers. This is certainly important for this audience. That you've complied with research standards and publisher and journal ethics and conflict of interest policies. That you're only submitting to one journal at a time. And this is actually another one that comes up quite frequently. And sometimes there's an honest mistake, multiple authors involved, it's not clear who is supposed to be submitting to the journal, and so you end up with a paper submitted multiple times. That's the version we hear a lot, at least. This does happen. Just be mindful, because there are ways of detecting this, and one of the, again, more frequent ways this happens is that the reviewer ends up being the same person that the other journal asked to review the paper, and the reviewer says, hey, I just saw this paper yesterday. And as with many ethics issues, you don't want that to be found out at that point. You want to make sure that anything that might come out later has been disclosed up front, has been dealt with up front, is transparent. You want to ask, and you want to acknowledge the contributions of each author. We'll talk in the next slide about what is an author. And you want to make sure that all your co-authors have agreed. Another recent case I had was a situation where a postdoc moved institutions, finished writing up some research, published it, put their old mentor's name on it. I don't know why they left the institution, what was there, but the mentor took exception to the fact that they'd been included as an author and not been consulted about it. And as a result, the paper ended up being retracted because of this. So you want to make sure that all the co-authors know that they're on this paper, that they've agreed with the contents of the paper, and that that's been dealt with pre-submission. So what does authorship mean? It varies across disciplines, cultures, and journals. Probably within medical science, the most commonly accepted definition comes from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. And they say that to be listed as an author, you have to meet 4 criteria, and you have to meet them all. You have to have made substantial contributions to conception or design of a work, or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation. And you have to be involved in drafting it or revising it before it's submitted. And you have to have given final approval to that version that's submitted. And this is a fairly newer one, you have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to accuracy or integrity are appropriately investigated. So that means if an ethics issue comes up later, you can't say, oh, I had no involvement with that part of the manuscript, ask him. Oh, yes, please.
I got to deal with something like that very recently when a paper had falsified flow cytometry graphs on them. And actually this group had published other falsified graphs in other journals as well, so that's how it was brought to my attention. But the corresponding author said, oh, I don't know anything about that somebody else provided those graphs to me, and I shouldn't be held accountable for that. And we had to say, no, you're all accountable.
Yep.
And we had to retract the paper as well.
No, it's true. It's exactly that. One of the editors I work with likes to call that game blame the postdoc, because that's most often what he hears in response.
Yeah, we had a recent scenario just a few months back where a student had contributed significantly to work being done in a clinical setting and had then gone on to graduate and wrote back and said, I saw that this paper has now been published, and the team that they had worked with and had actually communicated with us over time about the work that was being done, and so the mediation process between the team and faculty, and now that recent alum came to light. And so these scenarios can happen more commonly than one might think, especially to postdocs or students.
I think that's a very, very fair point. And one of the things that I would emphasize is if you're leaving an institution, make sure that someone there knows how to reach you, particularly your former group. Make sure they have up-to-date contact information. Because another excuse I hear sometimes is, I don't know how to reach that person anymore, they left my institution. So try and maintain that chain of communication if you can.
One comment I would make for those who are sort of more novice in the research is to decide ahead of time with the senior author, senior researcher, the order that you're going to be put in the manuscript, assuming you put in the appropriate amount of work for that order.
Yep, that's very important. Which brings me to my next slide. Thank you. You're setting me up so well. I appreciate this. So here are some general principles, and again, they do vary. A common rule is that the first author is the person who conducts or supervises data collection, analysis, presentation, and interpretation of results. And this can make a difference, as was alluded to. If you're a first author, if you're a middle author, if you're the last author, there are some implications there. So do make sure that you've agreed on that beforehand. A lot of journals will allow what's called share or dual first authorship. I've seen one situation where there were 3 first authors. But there are different ways of doing this, but make sure that's been agreed upon up front. Corresponding author. Here it's important to distinguish, you can actually have 2 corresponding authors. The first being the person who is responsible for the submission of the paper and oversees it through the acceptance. And then the second being the person who you put their contact information on the published article for people to reach out to. They don't necessarily have to be the same person, often they are. Why is this important? Because if that contact information is going on the published article, you want someone who there's going to be a reasonable chance that they'll still be reachable at that information within a relatively short amount of time. Some other things to be aware of when it comes to correspondences is that some journals will not allow submissions from people who are using Gmail, Yahoo, personal email accounts. This is because there have been a fairly high-profile number of cases in recent years where people have faked reviewers, faked authors, and supplied these kinds of email addresses that are easy to create and easy to create on behalf of someone else. So if you ever run into that, that's what they're looking to try and avoid. So where possible, do use your institutional address and just be prepared if that becomes an issue. You want to avoid ghost authorship. That's excluding authors who participated in the work. Common, if we think about ghostwriters, right, that used to be a major problem in medical publishing, and it's still probably not fully resolved. Gift authorships. That's including authors who did not actually contribute to the work. So I'm going to turn to conflicts of interest for a moment, because this is another one where, as I said earlier, you want everything disclosed up front. You don't want this coming out because no matter how innocuous it may be, if it comes out after a paper's been published that something was not disclosed, it always sounds more incriminating. It always sounds worse than it probably needed to be. There are a number of different conflicts of interest. When in doubt, disclose. Direct financial, that's probably the one people are most able to easily detect. If you work for a pharmaceutical company, you're not going to hide the fact that you work for a pharmaceutical company. The next one gets a little bit grayer. If you've received indirect financials, so if you've received honoraria, if you've received consultancy fees, if you have been paid to speak at a meeting by a company. This is where people aren't sure, well, how far do I go back? They paid me a pittance. Do I really need to declare that? Again, err on the side of caution. Some journals will be explicit about the time frame. Usually it's about 2 to 3 years going back that you're expected to declare. Some have higher standards, so just know what you're expected. And if worse comes to worse and you've over-declared, overshared, it's certainly a lot better than the opposite. Some of the types of conflict of interest that don't make their way into published papers, but that we still look for, particularly when it comes to, say, reviewers and selecting reviewers, career and intellectual. So if you are up against someone else for a particular position, and they know this, and they don't necessarily want to see you advance, there's a conflict there. Institutional, if someone works in the department down the hall from you, they should not be invited to review your paper. There's too much chance of a personal connection there. And so a lot of editors, a lot of journals will ask you to indicate recommended reviewers or reviewers who you would wish to exclude. Not all of them will use these reviewers, and they certainly will not rely entirely upon them. But if you're thinking about people to suggest, just bear this in mind. Don't suggest your best friend. Don't suggest your colleague from down the hall. Think about people who can honestly, intellectually evaluate your work. And similarly, if you're looking for people to exclude, these are the kinds of conflicts that don't show up in a cursory examination. So if you have a rival who's working on very similar work and there's a competitive situation there, be frank, be open about that. Know that the editor does not have to honor your request there, but the more clear you are about the request, the more likely they will be. My favorite one, I received a request to exclude a certain reviewer because of a physical altercation that had taken place the week before. I was very intrigued by that, but we did not invite that person. When most people think of research ethics, they probably think of this word, plagiarism, which is why I have put it in the middle. Because yes, plagiarism is huge, and it's probably the most common source of ethical complaints, although it's starting to give way to authorship and image manipulation. What is plagiarism? It's the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit, including those obtained through confidential review of others' proposals and manuscript. So the key words there, of course, are without giving appropriate credit. So many plagiarism cases would have been solved by putting quotation marks around something. But instead, people copied someone else's words. They liked the way it was expressed. It was done well. They put it out there. It gets discovered later in the process and becomes a significant problem. Yes?
And Elsevier, at least, and I'm sure the other journals as well, has ways to check for that. So that one of the first things I do when a paper comes in, if it looks, I'll look at the title and the abstract, and if it looks interesting, the next thing I click on is Crosscheck. Yes. And it tells me what % of that paper has been taken from other sources. And I've seen them as high as 70, 80%, and it can be whole paragraphs from other papers. And it's very easy to tell. Usually in the introduction, because it's very easy when you're writing that to say, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll cite that work. And we often see it in papers written by people whose first language isn't English. So if we see really, really nicely crafted sentences followed by really bad sentences, we know that there's a problem there.
Do you have any comments about sort of plagiarizing your own work? You know, kind of reusing language you've used in the past, maybe modifying a little bit?
You were a slide early that time, but I'll forgive you. So yes, exactly that. So can you plagiarize your own work, right? You said something beautifully before, why can't you use those same exact words? Or the methodology is the same. This creates a little bit of a gray area here, because technically, as was mentioned, there's these software programs, right? That will pull that up. It will say, wait a second, we've seen this exactly somewhere before. Now, without getting too much into the legality of it, there are certain issues to consider around copyright and any forms that might have been filled out with regard to that earlier on. But what it really comes down to, I think, is that if you pick up, say, the conclusions are duplicated from another article that you wrote, that's obviously going to be more of a problem than you borrowing a couple of lines from your introduction, because the introduction is a little bit more general, a little bit more stage setting. You still should be writing around it to avoid that, because technically you're not allowed to, in most cases, use the same language. The grayest area is methodology, because there are reasons why you would want to be consistent in describing that. And that's why with those different software programs, it does give you an overall percentage, but you also get to see the details. And editors will use their discretion there. They'll say, well, this person, it's got a percentage, but if you look at it, it's mainly around the methodology. So is this a significant problem? I probably work with the person to think about how they can redo that. Because probably the worst thing for methodology is you read one article and it says, please see the methods that I published previously in reference 3, and then you go there and it says, please see the reference 6, and you go down this black hole of methodology. So there are reasons that you want that methodology section to be robust, to be consistent. But if I'm running a duplication check and I start seeing that not only are the methods the exact same, but the sample size is the exact same, some of the results start to get to look the exact same, that's where you're really getting into some problematic areas as well. And these are all things that come up under the guise of plagiarism, because it's being detected in that way. So in general, I say avoid where you can, quote where you can, especially if it is something you really like the way you said before. You refer people back to your own work, and that's a positive all around. I'll go here. So we talked about Crosscheck, and this is a little bit more about what it is. Why do you want to make sure you cite this? And some journals actually place limits on citations, and that can make it that much trickier. And I acknowledge that. You want to place your own work in context, acknowledge the findings of those before you, and maintain credibility and accuracy. I joke about not wanting to go down that rabbit hole of methodology, but at the same time, there's useful information if you know that the same methodology has been followed in multiple articles, and being able to compare across that and see how the results came out. I had an author ask me recently, how do I find all of the published papers that use this particular mouse model? Because she was really curious to see how it was being used and what could be derived from it. Image manipulation is probably the up-and-coming star of the research ethics world. And this is in part because increasingly there are technological ways of detecting it. Much like with plagiarism. We don't know that plagiarism is actually growing. There's actually some science that's decreasing, but our awareness of it, our ability to detect it, has certainly increased. Same thing that's true of image manipulation. And there's a lot of well-meaning, I'm going to say vigilante, realizing that can be a loaded word, but there are a lot of people who are running these sort of scripts to go through previously published articles and detect any anomalies. And then writing to editors and saying, well, did you notice that panel 3B over here is exactly the same as panel 2 in this other figure if you flip it around? And these are exactly the kinds of things that the technology is well suited to detect. So again, general rules here. No specific feature with an image can be enhanced, obscured, moved, removed, or introduced. Adjustments of brightness, contrast, or color balance are usually acceptable as long as they don't obscure anything. What we're talking about is the difference between manipulation for clarity versus manipulation to deceive or to take advantage of maybe an image that looked better over here, and so you want to splice it into that other one because that panel was better. Nonlinear adjustments must be disclosed. Figures or parts of figures, and this is where most people get caught up, should not be duplicated or spliced together from figures published elsewhere, unless you're declaring that. Right? There are opportunities here. There might be reasons why a figure could legitimately appear in more than one article, but you would need to disclose that and make it clear as to what's going on and why. So when in doubt, disclose and cite. So what are the consequences of all these ethical issues? They get more severe as the process goes on. If it's found in a submitted article, then the paper is probably returned. Maybe, depending on the severity, a conversation is had. As you go further down that process, though, especially once it's published, there are a few recourses. Expressions of concern, corrections, retraction. Most journals at this point are members of the Committee on Publication Ethics and will follow their standardized workflows. And for most forms of workflow, if the editor is not convinced by your explanation, one of the next steps ends up being talk to the dean of the institution. And I don't know how well you know your deans, but that's not a conversation you want to be having with any of them. So again, make sure you've disclosed up front. There are legitimate consequences here, and with the increasing use of technology in all aspects of our lives, it is becoming easier to detect things that previously were not as easily detectable.